So I guess let's get started a little bit, and maybe each one of you can start by telling us about your experience with investing in bridges. Maybe Stefan, you want to start?
Yeah, so Gnosis recently became also a layer 1. Yeah, there's Gnosis chain, and so we became kind of everything. We became like a layer 1. We became a bridge builder. Yeah, Gnosis chain has its own bridge called OmniBridge. We became a bridge operator. We previously were also a bridge operator of OmniBridge, and yeah, of course, since we became a layer 1, we also started looking more into other like bridge technologies that we could utilize. And yeah, we recently did our first investment into a bridge, which was actually Nomad. And we're trying now to kind of combine the bridge technology together with our multisig to leverage it for governance actually of DeFi protocols. So right now we have a proposal live to bring Uniswap v3 to Gnosis chain. And of course, for every DeFi protocol such as Uniswap, it's interesting to see how does the value that is created on other networks have actually brought back to Ethereum and the token holders. And as part of this, obviously, bridge infrastructure is very important. It was a requirement that the bridge, there is a bridge that allows arbitrary messages to be passed by. And the security of the bridge is, of course, super important to them. To know that the bridge cannot tamper with the governance of Uniswap itself. And yeah, this has been so far our experience. And yeah, you can, if you're interested in this, you can read the proposal online to see what Uniswap really would like to have. But of course, security is the #1 concern.
Hi everyone, I'm Barbara. The question was about our investment in bridges.
Yeah, I mean, you did the inverse, right?
Yeah, I'm very invested in bridges. That's our primary focus. I personally have been very interested and involved specifically in cross-chain communication since about 4 years ago with my first startup, where we focused on between Bitcoin and Ethereum at the time. And since then, there's been just a huge wave of infrastructure of L1s and L2s, and this need has arisen really that everyone's of course you need cross-chain interop. And so Nomad is kind of the end result of many years of doing research and everything. Myself and one of my co-founders, James Presswich, and it's something that we're very involved and concerned about, especially with security first. It's very important. Nomad, where Nomad really shines is transference of high value packets of information, where because everything when you're communicating, it's just about trade-offs and which one are you willing to compromise on, in particular cost, speed, or security. And with Nomad, we wanted to be security first and made the design accordingly. And so Nomad is, right now we have token bridge, but we're also a generalized message passing protocol and working with projects like Gnosis chain to, able to do things like cross-chain governance. Yeah.
For me, the research kind of started early last year from the perspective that a lot of L1s that have been building for years have finally gone live. And it was the realization that for a lot of those chains, the go-to-market was connecting to Ethereum for users, for liquidity. And it was this realization that they need to do it. Ethereum itself will not build any of these bridges. It's more so the other ones that need to get those customers. And then it was a realization that, okay, this is actually going to be pretty important. So I started to do research around the first half of last year, missed the entire NFT run-up as that was happening because I was doing all of this conversations with a lot of these bridges. Spoke with several dozen, made 2 investments in Nomad and Connext, and published a piece around August of last year that kind of summarized my takeaways from that research and those conversations, and really just trying to create a framework for people to understand kind of the whole spectrum of design choices around building these things.
As for us, I would say it kind of started out also with when we were kind of leading the investments at Consensus, and we were partnering with ChainSafe, who was trying to basically enable a much more modular construction of a bridge for substrate and EVM execution layers in some way, shape, and sense. And starting out with more so a federated trust model, but really recognizing the same fact that Dimitri was pointing out, that it's not ultimately the responsibility for Ethereum to ultimately bridge this, bridge state and bring about message passing and bring about a framework for the same. But it was through these conversations that I think we realized that it's ultimately people who've had a very strong and core experience in really understanding the development of interoperability from a first principles approach, that we got to speak with Connext back in the day, and we've invested in Connext. And once we actually spoke with James, whose work we've been following from early on. Especially, you guys should actually check out his talk at CSCon back in 2019, I think, where he actually speaks about the notion of building interoperability from like a first principle perspective, and we've kind of been really impressed by the amount of thought that they've put into Nomad, and that's something that we're super proud supporters of as well.
Great, thank you. So actually, Dimitri, you brought up an interesting point, which was the realization from the ecosystem that we had to build these bridges. And do you think that the bridges can or should be public goods?
Ideally, yes, but there is this incentive that you need to have people build secure, safe, performant technology. I think there needs to be incentives in place for the developers to actually do it. I don't think that there's enough talent within any given foundation to actually build this, because it's really difficult problems in distributed systems that you need to solve.
Isn't it also really expensive to run these bridges?
Yes, in the sense that you need to build the infrastructure, you have to hire the front operational costs around it. I don't think it's bad to have incentive models that are aligned with having good teams actually build this stuff. We call them bridges. I think you could also look at them as airlines. And I think there's a lot of choices on how you build your plane. You know, like how much like space do you have between each seat? Which airports are you connecting to? And different airlines could start to compete with each other on certain customers, certain geographies, and I think that's okay.
Great, thanks. And how do you all feel about the sustainability of being able to like build and maintain these bridges? Are there mechanisms or in place that you've thought about could be good?
Sorry, so just shortly coming back to the public goods aspect, I think for example, for Gnosis Chain, like we have our own bridge solution. It's the native bridge, and I think you would not do yourself a favor at this point to give up, let's say, the authority of this bridge to someone else. So of course we were thinking of like, should we just go use Wormhole, for example? And what would this effectively mean? You would give the authority for like creating the native tokens, let's say native DAI or like native whatever, to this bridge. And this is something that cannot be necessarily easily reverted. So you have to be very careful about this. And what does it mean being the public good, right? Like, of course, the software can be open source, should be open source, everyone can fork it. But ultimately, there are very strong network effects around bridges. Like, again, like whoever is able to bridge like the native tokens on this network is de facto the native bridge and has a lot of power. And so I think it's important that if you consider the public good, which in my opinion should be, that it should be up to maybe the token holders of this network to decide, like, okay, what is the public bridge? Yeah, in terms of maintaining bridges, well, bridges are such a crucial part of infrastructure, at least when we talk about the native bridge, that this is something where I would not feel comfortable, like, depending on someone else. So this is like a competency that you, in my opinion, should have yourself. Or would be, at this point, too early, in my opinion, to kind of pick a winner that you could not revert eventually, because this is something that would become extremely difficult. I guess if you would do this, then eventually you would have to do a hard fork to eventually revert this, and that's something that should be avoided.
I guess like on the note of public goods, that is something. I mean, I think it's kind of like roads, right? Highways and everything in a country, it benefits everybody if we have roads, right? Well-maintained roads that go to where we want to go, that are secure, they have the right traffic lights, right? And people aren't just like doing whatever they want on the road. But it does come at a cost. Like those have to be maintained, but there is a lot of benefit to having it as a public good. And if it's who do you give that authority to? It's a good question, right? And so like it's how decentralized is the protocol, or a lot of times it's faster and easier you start centralized, but if you have a plan to decentralization, I think that's also acceptable, especially early on. But I think in the long run, like Nomad we really want this to be a public good as well. I think it's good for the ecosystem.
I mean, one take that I basically had was, if you kind of look at the notion of centralized bridges, it was essentially exchanges that started out. So you swap your asset and you could get your asset in another place in some sense, and you probably needed some of that centralization in place because technology at that point and understanding was not exactly mature. And people have obviously made a lot of value trying to basically control the flows of economic value and state. But I think we are at a point where we can slowly actually restart thinking about the notion of bridging state and value again from the ground up, and really kind of think about how the community should think and place a lot of value in terms of their understanding of what bridges really lend to themselves as users, to the ecosystem that they're part of, and the other ecosystems that they're part of, and use that as a basis to actually create this notion of a public good that everyone can kind of rally behind.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's take it back to the basics. We talk a lot about bridges and bridging, but it seems like not all bridges were made equal. And the definition of a bridge or a framework for a bridge is very nebulous. So, we hear about things like, TBTC and IBC, Rainbow Bridge, Nomad. What does it really mean? What are some of the frameworks or designs of bridges that are out there? And why do you think some of them are better or worse than others? So open to some hot takes here.
I mean, one way to cut it, there's different ways to cut it. I think 3 buckets that I could try to fit these in, and there are always exceptions, one is external validators and federations. This is usually some group of actors. They look at some outbox on one chain. They have an inbox on another chain. They agree on the validity of the transactions, and you're basically placing trust in that validator set. Another model is like clients and relays. This is more so relying on the data and consensus of the chains that you're bridging. I think this is a safer model than a validator set because your security is more so equal to the chains that you're bridging rather than the security model of the validator set. And a third bucket is what I call liquidity networks. I would bucket Connext and Hop in these. I kind of look at them as off-chain order books that hold inventory of the different chains that it's bridging. And they have fallback mechanisms that are also relatively equal to the security of the chains that you're connecting. So I prefer like clients, relays. I would put Nomad kind of in the relay-ish bucket, but it's hard to fit them all in. I think those are way safer than validator sets. I really don't like those, and I don't think they're good for the ecosystem.
Just like add on to that, I think it's, like I mentioned, it's a trade-off between cost, speed, and security, right? So with something like external validation, it can be very fast because the validator set can agree on consensus quickly. So that's really good for that, but a lot of times you either have to compromise on cost or speed or security in that instance. With header relays, they are probably the most secure option, but they are also very expensive because you have to send that information regardless if there's anything that happened. And that can be quite expensive. Like TBTC is a little bit, and the theory behind that is at some point if you have enough, the cost amortizes and it's quite affordable, but especially early on, that's usually not the case. And then with something like Nomad, you kind of get like, it's a middle road model, right? It's like a lot cheaper than header relays. It's not as secure as header relays, but it is more secure than validation sets. And I think it comes down to, when are you going to verify something? What are you verifying? And like, it matters like where that happens in order to mitigate the risk. And so that's why Nomad compromises on speed to introduce that fraud proof window to allow the off-chain actors and everything to respond accordingly before you confirm that on the destination chain. And so that's the model in order to kind of like, what can we do now with the technology that we have versus eventually, we'd love to get to a fully, decentralized, safe, and cost-efficient like solution.
Okay, so speaking of safety, we saw some headlines in the media about bridge hacks. Specifically, the latest that come to mind are, Wormhole and Ronin. So maybe, like, Stefan, you can tell us about, like, what types of bridges were those and, like, what kind of security compromises were made there? Yeah.
Yeah, like Wormhole and Ronin, I think they both were pretty much simple multisigs. So in case of Wormhole, like the operators of the bridge, they are also involved in staking on, I think, the different networks they are supporting. So they have very good understanding of what's happening on those networks, and they can be trusted. In case of Wormhole, I think the complexity of Wormhole comes from bridging networks that rely on very different technology. So bridging Solana and Cosmos and other networks. And as far as I remember, it was basically just like an implementation issue that was causing the exploit, and it was not like a collision of anyone operating it. So it was just the complexity of implementation, I think, that was causing this, and it's something that, of course, we also have to keep in mind when we build bridges. Like with multisigs, also like keep them as simple as possible. A bridge can be much more complex depending on what you want to integrate into this bridge, and of course, given that there's a lot of money in those bridges, especially in Wormhole was a lot, unfortunately, you also have significant risk in case there's an exploit. In case of Ronin, I think it was more like an OPSEC problem of eventually one entity holding multiple keys and not having a great observation of what's happening on the network, not understanding that the exploit is happening for several days. And this can be easily prevented, for example, by having like better like monitoring systems or like daily limits incorporated into this bridge contract. This would have been also very helpful for Wormhole, obviously. Like probably don't have to allow like a daily limit of 600 million or whatever was withdrawn. So yeah, I think there are still simple measurements that can be taken to improve bridges very significantly, even if they are just multisigs. So yeah.
So you just talked about steps to improve the design. What do you think is the best design or architecture for these bridges?
Well, of course, the best design would be a completely trustless bridge, right? Where you don't have to rely on anyone else necessarily. That's kind of would be the perfect scenario. Of course, it's usually not easily can be easily accomplished. Something that we are currently evaluating for Gnosis chain is like a very kind of drastic design. We want to make this, like the consensus of Gnosis chain dependent on the consensus of Ethereum itself. So what this would mean is like if there's a reorg on Ethereum, then there would be a reorg on Gnosis chain. If you send a transaction on Ethereum, this is something that is immediately recognized on the Gnosis chain network. So you could do like an atomic transaction, and it is a fully trustless design because you always are aware of what the state on Ethereum is on Gnosis chain. Going the other way around is impossible because unfortunately Ethereum will not depend on Gnosis chain consensus, unfortunately. So there we have to fall back to other mechanisms, I guess, and thinking about, okay, how can we use, for example, the Ethereum validator set to eventually also validate Gnosis chain. This would, of course, increase security quite significantly. This would be kind of the perfect case scenario, but yeah, we will see. At least the one way, I think, is something that can be done. And of course, no other network would ever, I guess, consider making themselves so dependent on Ethereum, but we can do this, so this would be a very interesting approach.
Great. So,
But-
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think that there's like a best design. I think that there's way too many trade-offs along the spectrum around speed, security, capital efficiency, extensibility, that no one bridge is going to do it all, just like no base layer could do it all. And I think a lot of the success around Solana was because it made such significant trade-offs along the decentralization spectrum that it popped out a use case and a customer base and a philosophy that resonated with others. And I think like you're not going to use Nomad for cross-chain art, right? Like the latency is too high. But you could use it for high-value transactions that need that kind of security and don't really care about latency. And I think that's fine. And you'll find a lot of like really interesting use cases pop out of that. So to me, the best designs are the ones that very consciously take those design trade-offs and implement some architecture that will pop out a use case that a certain user is going to want.
Great. So actually, that takes me into my next question, which is, Barbara, you talked about the interoperability trilemma just earlier, and I would love to hear about what are those three components that we have trade-offs, and then would love to hear about, what are the right use cases or scenarios that Dapp developers should consider when choosing one type of bridge over the other, or the trade-offs that they make.
Yeah, so again, so first, cost, speed, security is usually the one that we look at. There are other things, right, like reusability.
What are the interoperability trilemma? What are the components of that?
I mean, I do, those are my 3 points. There may be others, but so cost, right? How much does it cost to send these transactions, to verify them, to process them? Speed, how fast does that, settle on the destination chain? And then security, which is how secure is that, the protocol that underlies that transaction. So the bridge. But there's also things like Dimitri mentioned, like reusability, which is, do you have to write bespoke code between each of these pairs? Nomad is abstracted down. The protocol is just like raw bytes, so it's EVM compatible. We have plans to we can also go to non-EVM, but we would need to rewrite contracts, and so it's easily deployable. The smart contract side, and then there's others, but those are probably the main ones I would say. Maybe there's the trilemma, but I guess it could also be a square. Or a rhombus.
If it was a rhombus, what would it be?
Those four. It would be those four. I guess we could think of a 5. There could be a star. And so these are all the factors. You can't have all of them, right? It's always the 2 of 3 kind of thing. And then there's variations within that, right? And so when you're sending something like assets, right? And actually, we'll rewind to, I personally don't like the term bridge because I think it's the wrong metaphor for thinking about what's actually happening. So there's the most common bridging mechanism, right? Is you lock up assets on the origin chain. So if you're sending Ethereum to Moonbeam, for example, you lock up your ETH in a contract, and then after some whatever process, then it is a representation of that is minted on the destination. So what that means is maybe it doesn't matter if you're only sending $10 worth of ETH over, right? It's whatever, if I lose it, no big deal. But what if you're sending $1 million or 10 million or even 1,000 or 10,000, right? When you realize that you're locking it up and putting it somewhere, and then you're getting a representation, like a code check, then your security assumptions will change because you start asking, well, who's guarding my stuff? Is it secure? Is it in a vault? Is it in some shack at the side of the road? So these are the questions you start asking, and then I think people will start, those are the questions that need to be answered. But when the term bridge, because there's real life connotations, people think they're moving their assets with them, which isn't necessarily the case. If you're the asset issuer though, you could burn and mint, but there's some coordination that requires that. And so it's just all about what matters to you. And with Nomad too, it's there's modular blockchains, right? There's this whole thing with that. There's also, you can have modular interoperability, where Nomad, we just focus on, we just want to pass this stuff safely. What those messages mean and everything, we'll leave that to app developers, right? So when you're building a xApp, so xApp, so cross-chain application, you form those meaning to those messages in the same way that you would do that if you're building a website and you're just passing JSON back and forth, right? Those bytes are meaningless until the developer decides what they mean. And so in that same way, that application logic is abstracted away. So Nomad doesn't care. We just want to make sure that your stuff gets there safely. And so like the token bridge is an application built on top of the Nomad protocol. And so these are, those I think it matters where like it executes. And so with Nomad, we sacrifice the latency for security. But you can integrate with partners like Connext to provide faster liquidity for users. So I think even if you're trading things off, there are ways that, working with other protocols, projects, where you can mitigate against that. And so I think we're really moving towards a more like, I would say specialized kind of, where it's like you do one thing and you do really well, and then you combine all that together, right?
Yeah, I think it's basically the same point that James makes when he speaks about essentially thinking about a root of trust and who's kind of establishing that and what exactly that kind of means for application developers. And so it's fundamentally the problem of who is the verifier for this framework of passing messages from one blockchain to the other. And so we really need to kind of fundamentally educate application developers to start thinking about economic security, smart contract security, and issues that kind of underpin bridge design in some way, shape, and sense, so that they have a clear understanding of what exactly is important for them when they are kind of thinking of developing cross-chain applications, and use that also as a mechanism to kind of see how exactly they can kind of build additional frameworks or protocols on top of relatively secure and, should we say, simplistic or simple to understand in modular designs, and basically construct different kinds of product experiences for the use cases that they kind of have in mind.
Great, yeah, and I know you mentioned a little bit about the term bridge being a bit of a misnomer. Maybe it's closer to a locker and some sort of virtual hologram. But what can I move on these bridges? Like, what can I think a lot of us are looking at sort of these token bridges, token lockers, but like, can I move data? Can I move NFTs? Can I move, like, how can we think about it in terms of the interoperability that they create?
Yeah, so there's sort of a standard, the arbitrary message bridge. So it's a format that allows you to, as it says, send arbitrary messages. And this can be interpreted as an ERC20 token transfer, NFT transfer, like an interaction with a multisig, basically anything. And that's also, I think, how most bridges work. Like they implement on the core layer the arbitrary message bridge protocol, and then you have different UIs that allow you to, to kind of create those messages for ERC20 token transfers, for NFT transfers, and so on.
I think like another use case is cross-chain governance. It's message passing, but it's not assets, right? And I think we still need to figure out what's that used for. Who are the applications that really need cross-chain governance? I think it will increasingly be required as the applications themselves go to other base layers as a go-to-market and expanding that and tapping into new kinds of users and geographies. So I think that's another piece that we're going to see pop up over the next 3, 6, 9 months.
We were also kind of speaking with a couple of teams who were really thinking about, say, for instance, locking up the V tokens on one ecosystem and kind of controlling gauge emissions on other ecosystems that the users have deposits on in some way, shape, and sense. And even earlier today, I think this was just kind of speaking with someone outside who was very interested in trying to figure out what it would basically mean to enable like cross-chain lending. Having the capability to bridge assets and especially staked assets from one ecosystem to the other, and essentially drive better forms of capital efficiency and also drive rewards in a way where you could actually have the control and modularity to direct token flows, not just to one ecosystem, but to multiple others. And so it's going to be a very, very interesting scenario when you kind of see not just like retail users, but DAOs and protocols actually starting to kind of deploy applications cross-chain and figure out what exactly they are thinking about when they're doing that, and kind of tapping into the capabilities of bridging and message passing mechanisms to actually facilitate those use cases. So we're still very, very early out, but it's one very, very fascinating area to kind of think about.
And I think another way to frame it is a developer platform. I think in probably 2 years, a lot of the bridges will be not calling themselves bridges; they'll be calling themselves developer platforms. I think, like James was talking about earlier, there's a ton you need to understand about how to build cross-chain native applications, but I think it's going to be abstracted from the user. Today, most users go to a front end to just transfer assets. I think in 1 to 2 years, they're going to go to an application and be able to use all the assets from all the different chains for whatever that application wants to do, but it's going to be baked into the UI. And ideally, that application is building on like the infrastructure that allows for that cross-chain message passing, that cross-chain asset transfer.
Yeah, so I think like the way that I would think about it is there is going to be a new like developer paradigm that needs to like perpetuate throughout the industry and people need to be familiar with. And I think in the same way that if you've never built, an application before, like a web application or a Dapp, there's a new mental model that you have to adopt, right? And so that's going to be the case with cross-chain applications. And so like Nomad, we have an SDK, which is used, you can start using it now, and you can build like a cross-chain application. So like a token bridge cross-chain application. And I think there's new ways that people will think about it in the same way that as developers, you're like, in the back end, right? You're like, maybe I'm going to pull from AWS. Maybe I'm going to go use GCP. Maybe I'll use a digital node like Droplet or something, right? And you're just pulling information and running your own servers and doing your own processing, on your own, and you pull all that together and you present it in a nice package for the user. And eventually, I think we'll get to that point where when you're building, you're like, oh, hey, like I want to get this information from that chain. I want to send it over here and then aggregate that for the user. And so you can do that when you just think about all bridging is. It's just you're just sending information back and forth. And right now we're still kind of figuring out like how do we send that information safely? How long does it take? And all these kind of things. And so I think we'll get there. And I think that would be like ideal where it's just like you use something like Nomad or the protocols and the user doesn't know, only developers do. And I think that's like the goal with cross-chain applications.
Yeah, that's definitely the ideal. Dimitri, you brought something up interesting earlier, which was the idea of a developer platform. And I know that Connext has been working on the Amarak hard fork to enable something that's known as cross-chain contract calls. And I guess the question is like, what does that really mean for developers and why does it matter?
The way I look at it is this application infrastructure cycle where you thought experiment like what came first, the airplane or the landing strip. It's the airplane. You kind of have some use case and then you have infrastructure that's built underneath. And then others could leverage that infrastructure, that new infrastructure for new use cases. And I think you had a bunch of L1s popping up and then everyone said, oh, we need to build these connections. And then now we have a bunch of these connections. And so the next wave, I think, are applications that are going to use this infrastructure that was built for things that are cross-chain native first. I don't think we fully understand what that paradigm looks like, what that UX looks like. If you're bridging across 3 different chains, does a user need to have MetaMask, Phantom, and Terra Station? Or can you have some native wallet that has the like the signatures across every chain. And I think that's going to take a while for devs to figure out. And I don't think we fully understand, but I think you have the creativity there. And I think a lot of the SDKs are going to give that to devs. And it's kind of like, well, here you go. Like, here's your palette. Do it. Hopefully do it safely.
Awesome. Yeah. So as our final question, since this is Dev Connect after all, please give us your hot take on the future of bridging and interoperability. Praneeth, kick us off on the spot.
Let's start with what Connext is doing. I think, asynchronous callbacks is incredible. Just the capability for you to basically trigger actions in one ecosystem, have cross-chain contract calls that are happening in another execution layer, and basically having the outcomes that really come back to you without actually having to create new synthetic assets, but basically having a very, very seamless flow that you typically see in traditional web apps is something that's going to be super, super cool to ultimately see as a framework in and of itself. So I just can't wait to see what application developers choosing to build on Connext and Nomad would actually get to do.
I think the developer platform was my hot take. I'm not sure I have much to add beyond that.
Doubling down, developer platform. Noted. Barb.
Oh, I don't have a hot take. I guess I can make one. But a hot take would be that Nomad would be critical infrastructure and everyone uses it, but developers know about it. And I think what I'm really excited to see is people building. I think we're going to see a lot of shitty things happen, to be honest. Like, you know, we're going to build this environment that people, like cross-chain arbitrage, what's that going to look like? What's going to happen when people do multiple calls from like multiple chains at the same time? Well, you know, you could have like one-way just like spam, right? And like, so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things. There's going to be a lot of bad ideas, but I think there's going to be a lot of good ideas, things that we don't even know what can happen because we don't have that infrastructure to play around with yet. And so I'm really excited to see what everyone does. I think it'll be very, very fascinating.
Yeah, I think that maybe multi-chains, but well, I'm not really sure anymore if multi-chain is actually the way forward, because look at the user experience of today, right? It's terrible. Like, it's still really terrible, and we just make it even worse by making it multi-chain. And I think bridges are still important, of course, and I think they will be used for rebalancing between networks most of the time. Otherwise, you're going to use state channels or liquidity bridges. And yeah, of course, we are always assuming a user experience can be fixed, but maybe the last few years have been a bit too sobering. But the user experience is still pretty bad, in my opinion, and with multi-chain, you just make it worse. Looking at, for example, smart contract accounts, right? Like being able to, right now it's not possible even to easily bridge from one network to another if you bridge from a safe, because like the contract might have a different address on another network. Try to explain this to any user. Like, yeah, again, like I think it will be an exploration phase. It will take very long time. Bridges are needed. But my assumption is that most users will just operate on one network. And there are few users, like power users, that will be migrating between networks, but this will not be the daily case.
Wonderful. Some spicy takes from our panelists on the future of bridges and interoperability. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you.